Hi, and welcome to this Indicator 13 module on age-appropriate transition assessments. My name is Lavinia Grippentrog. I'm the transition specialist at the State Board of Education, and let's get started. So when thinking about transition assessments, in terms of compliance, this is the question that needs to be answered. Is there evidence that the students' measurable post-secondary goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessments? So when we come to look at your transition plans, this is what we're looking for, is age-appropriate transition assessments. So really, transition assessment really leads to the development of the entire transition plan. So from the transition information, we then build post-secondary goals, transition services, annual goals, course of study, agency linkages. So really it all kind of flows from that foundation of good transition assessments. So they're used to provide information on students' strengths, interests, preferences, and needs. So that's important that when we're choosing transition assessments that we are addressing student strengths, interests, preferences, and needs, and looking for those gaps where students really need to have some transition services. Transition assessments help students make connections between their IEP and their post's high ambitions. So it's really important that we engage students in the transition assessment process because it really helps them to connect what they are doing in school to what they want to be doing when they graduate. So just to show you the transition services flowchart again, you'll notice that age-appropriate transition assessments are at the top. So in other words, they really are that foundation of the entire transition plan. Without good assessment, it is really difficult to formulate appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, and from that the services and the course of study and the IEP are all built. So it's very important to have age-appropriate transition assessment information. So let's address the compliance piece first. What do you absolutely need to be compliant in this area of Indicator 13? So we need to remember that transition assessments begin at age 14. So they must be conducted every year starting when the child is 14. There must be evidence that the transition assessment was completed prior to the current IEP. So it must be dated and conducted prior to that student's current IEP. And assessment results must be written in the student's PLAFUP, or a copy of the current transition assessment must be in the file. So either one of those is considered compliant. It's just really nice if that assessment information is summarized in the PLAF statement. But you can also attach a copy of the current assessment to the IEP or have it readily available in the file. Just to review, transition assessments typically fall under these 4 domains. There are a lot of transition assessments out there to cover career interests and employment. I would say the majority of transition assessments are typically in this area, which is certainly important, but not to say that the others are not. So college readiness and post-secondary training is also an area where there are several transition assessments out there. And at the end of this module, I will connect you with some resources. So if you don't have those readily available to you in your LEA, you'll be able to find those. Also, what's really important is to assess the student's self-determination and self-advocacy skills. And there are some really nice tools out there to do that. And then independent and adult living skills, and oftentimes we think of these assessments as only appropriate for our students with more significant disabilities, but there are many different independent living skills assessments out there that are appropriate, I would say, for all students. So typically for transition assessments, you will be using informal assessments. So these are interviews. These are ones that you can make up, or they could be ones that you are finding online. Interviews with students, interviews with parents are when appropriate, questionnaires, and direct observations, also environmental and situational assessments. So if you have observational data when a student is in a different setting, it could be an employment setting, it could be a community setting, different classroom settings, that's great transition assessment information. And then of course curriculum-based assessments. So oftentimes transition curriculum will have pre and post assessments, and you can use those as well. Sometimes formal assessments are used for transition assessments, but not typically, unless an IEP is also aligning with the 3-year reevaluation, in which case you may use one of these formal assessments for transition assessments, but those would be the types of assessments such as intelligence tests, achievement tests, aptitude tests, employability tests, and adaptive behavior. So those are just examples of formal assessments. So where can you find these transition assessments? So the first link is a transition assessment manual. It's a fairly large document. I think it's about 25 pages, and that lists various transition assessments and under those domain areas that I mentioned in the slide before. And it also will indicate whether that assessment is a free assessment or if there's a cost associated with it. I always encourage folks to look at the free assessments first because there are many of them, and there are many good ones. So the transition assessment manual has many that are online, but also ones that are downloadable PDFs, paper pencil type of assessments. So you'll find a variety of assessments there. Then the second resource, NTACT Transition Assessment Toolkit. NTACT stands for National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. And they have also a nice toolkit that also indicates whether the test is formal or informal. And what's really nice about this toolkit also is that it has an implementation timeline. So it can be helpful when you are working with younger students and you're not quite sure what types of assessments might be appropriate for an 8th or 9th grader, for example. It puts the assessments into a timeline format. So let's talk about some best practice in transition assessment. So you want to make sure that you use assessments from several domains. Like we mentioned before, to be compliant, you only need to show one transition assessment prior to the IEP. However, it is nice to gather information in different areas. So really consider transition assessments in those domains mentioned. And then become familiar with types of transition assessments. There are many out there. They have different characteristics. Some are more lengthy than others. Some are more appropriate for certain students than others, depending on whether that student can read or is able to give verbal answers. So really just your best bet is to just really become familiar, and then it'll be easier to determine which assessments to use for your students. And know your student and determine, based on their transition needs, their functioning level, what would be the most appropriate transition assessment to use. Also, including the student in that transition assessment as much as possible is really important. Some assessments are completely designed for students to complete on their own, where other ones also include teacher information or parent information, but make sure that you're including the student in that process, and also letting them know why it's so important that they do transition assessments. It's really about discovering their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs, where they have some gaps where the transition plan can really help fill those gaps so that they are prepared for life after high school. Include parents and or other IEP team members when appropriate. So oftentimes CTE personnel in your LEAs may be conducting assessments that could be very appropriate as a transition assessment, or counselors oftentimes are conducting assessments with all students in the building related to career interests and strengths, and so those are also appropriate to use as your transition assessment. You would just want to make sure, if you are using those, that they were dated and completed prior to that student's IEP and within that school year to be compliant. So if you have any more questions on how to make sure that you are addressing compliance with transition assessments in IEPs, please feel free to contact me. Here's my information, and I'd be happy to help. Thank you.